Daniel Dalton, my industry, the digital advertising industry, is meeting in Milan next week for our big annual conference. We're going to talk a lot about GDPR implementation, the heroic effort that the industry is making to comply with the GDPR. But as everybody there is focused on GDPR and almost getting to the end of the race, there is the e-privacy discussion kind of looming off on the horizon and threatening to put into question a lot of the investments that these companies have made. So we have the chance to talk to you briefly before Interact. I just want to put a couple of questions about the intersection between GDPR and e-privacy and what the impact of both of them, and especially e-privacy, might be on the European digital economy. So we have done some research, and there's a lot of other research that wasn't done by us that suggests that most consumers say that they would like to have the possibility, at least the choice, of accessing a certain amount of online content and services for free, on the understanding that some of those are probably funded by advertising. The e-privacy discussion looks like taking that choice out of their hands. The outcome in the European Parliament's first reading would basically have made the digital advertising, the data-driven advertising business model commercially inoperable. When it is a question of wanting just the choice, which services do you subscribe to, and which services do you want to choose not to subscribe to? Who represents those voices? Do you think that the consumer who wants at least the option of not paying for everything, is his or her voice adequately represented in the discussions that you've observed on e-privacy over the last year or two?
Well, no, I don't think they're represented at all. I mean, I did my best to try and represent that argument because I think here there's a lot of focus on consumer protection. There's never really a focus on consumer empowerment. And the thing that the digital revolution has given all of us is a huge democratization, if you like, of consumers and consumer empowerment. Consumers can really move with their feet in a way that they never could before. And I think that's a really important part of the digital revolution that we're in danger of losing with the discussion on e-privacy. I think the real problem with e-privacy is it's portrayed in Brussels as if this is about privacy. This is about fundamental right to privacy, which is enshrined in the treaties. It's a key point for many policymakers here. And I think the problem is we looked at it, even the committee that we looked at it at, it was all about fundamental rights, and it wasn't about the bigger industry concerns. It wasn't about consumers in general. It wasn't about industry and how we develop European industry going forward. And I think that's a really, really big missed opportunity. It's something we tried to address in plenary here, and we're hoping that the Council look at it in a little bit more sensible way.
Yeah, so the empowerment feels to us like exactly the point. Like the General Data Protection Regulation was based on, the promise of that regulation was giving transparency and control to the user, in exchange for which European consumers would go online in their millions and create the opportunity for industry to build innovative, interesting digital services. That deal does look a little bit like falling apart now. So we have GDPR interpretation that is increasingly restrictive, increasingly narrowing, increasingly apparently kind of seeming to withdraw that bargain. And I wonder to what degree you think the European Parliament is aware of that, or do you think that the perspective is really so much on the fundamental rights and not this kind of moving of the goalposts that we see?
I think the problem is these two files are in a silo, if you like, in the European Parliament. We dealt with the GDPR, and now e-privacy is something separate. I think that's how legislation is done here in Brussels, and I think that creates part of the problem. For me, the real challenge, of course, was actually you could have solved the issues of e-privacy if you'd addressed confidentiality of communications, for example, in the GDPR, and there's a big debate about that at the time. The Commission was opposed to that because, of course, by doing that, there's no need to update the e-privacy regulations. And actually the best way forward, and I think we're seeing this happen now actually, is that there are lots of problems with the implementation of GDPR. Many member states are already saying that they're struggling to meet the deadlines. We're only a day or two away from it coming into force. This was always clear. It was such a big piece of legislation with such a big impact that it was always going to have problems in its implementation. So to me, the most sensible approach would be, let's see what the problems are with the implementation, and let's try and address that with e-privacy or future regulations in a year or two's time when you know how to address the issues. Because one other point is GDPR is already outdated. I mean, if you look at things like the development of blockchain, and if you're looking about private data in future blockchains, there's not sure that that's compliant with GDPR. If you look at things like the Amazon Go shops that they're creating in Seattle, there's questions about whether that's going to be compliant with GDPR. So, you know, the world is moving on, and European legislation, I think, is still already becoming outdated. And I think it's very important going forward that we want to make sure, if we're going to keep Europe as a centre of digital innovation, that we get legislation that fits that, and not legislation that is reacting to things that were 3 or 4 years out of date.
One of the most frequently adduced arguments in favor of an e-privacy regulation is that there's a problem of secret tracking. You know, we've got to do something to stop secret tracking of users online. And yet, as you say, well, the GDPR is going to make secret tracking impossible, because you always need to know who is processing your data, which data, for what purpose. It has to be right up front in the user interface. Do you think? How do you explain that this argument is still adduced when anyone who's actually gone through the 80 pages or 102 pages of the GDPR can see that in fact secret tracking is just impossible if the law is enforced? Is this another situation where, instead of actually effectively enforcing the law, Europe is considering bringing on more rules?
Well, definitely on the second part. I think Europe is always bringing too much, particularly in this area. But I think the key problem with the secret sort of tracking type of issues is that there's a fundamental lack of trust. Policymakers here don't really understand, and I think they reflect the views of quite a few of their constituents. They're not really sure what companies are doing with their data, and many of them are not necessarily tech savvy, particularly some of the policymakers here, not necessarily truly tech savvy. They don't really understand the process that means when they go online and something is being offered to them based on a personal recommendation, they don't quite understand how that has happened, and there must be something going on behind the scenes that's a bit malevolent or a bit dodgy that brings that forward. So I think you're always up against that problem, this lack of trust and lack of really understanding in what's going on. If there's a lack of understanding, there's always a belief that there's something untoward going on. And I think that probably explains why, even with the GDPR provisions, that this debate is still going on. I think also, you know, what happened with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, that plays into that sort of discussion as well, is that people are still not quite sure how all of this stuff works. And that means it's open for people to then start questioning it.
Indeed. We are, as I said, we're meeting next week. You have too many things to do, and unfortunately are not going to be able to join us. What message would you give beyond the advice and insight that you've just laid out? What message would you give to the European digital advertising industry gathering in Milan next week? Is there any other sort of uber thought about the digital advertising and the digital economy, digital media? What can we do? We're in a hard time right now.
Well, I think first of all, I'm sorry that I can't be there with you. I would love to have been there with you, but unfortunately I have some other commitments, so I couldn't make it. But I'm sure you're having a great time in Milan. I think the key is the e-privacy debate is not lost. You know, the council is still debating what its position is going to be. In Parliament, we actually got a vote through that meant that the final support for e-privacy was a very small majority in the Parliament. And I think that means that the position that you see from the European Parliament is a weak position. It's not necessarily what is going to be reflected in the final legislation. And there are elements of the GDPR that can still bring across into e-privacy that I think will allow you to continue doing most of what you're doing. But I think you've also got to be upfront. You've got to accept that GDPR is coming. There are concerns about privacy that people portray. People don't really know how these systems work or how this economy works, if you like. And so because of that, I think you've got to go out there and really get the information out there to people of how you do it, the sort of consent that you get from people, and the fact that most of the customers, from what I see, actually want this sort of tailored service. I mean, I have not had constituents come to me to say, in my time in the European Parliament, that they're very unhappy about what is happening to their data online. That doesn't happen. They maybe get concerned when they hear about a big scandal with, like I said, with Facebook or something like that. But in general, certainly in my constituency, certainly in the UK, there's not this huge mistrust and concern. So I think you just need to get out there and explain to people actually what happens and make the economic arguments and the pro-consumer arguments. Because I think there's a valid path there that people would understand.
All right, so a hopeful message for us to kick off our event with. Thanks very much.
Thank you.